The situation unfolding inside Russia right now feels less like the steady march of a confident superpower and more like the shaky, uneven footsteps of a government losing its balance. Tonight, we are witnessing what can only be described as a slow burn revolution, an internal unraveling that Vladimir Putin never imagined possible and certainly never planned for. The war he launched with absolute certainty, the war he declared would be swift and decisive, is now a grinding stalemate that has drained the Russian military, rattled the Kremlin, and exposed cracks in the very structure that keeps Putin's authority intact. And those cracks, they're widening. Even long, loyal insiders are whispering carefully, strategically, that perhaps the president is not the infallible figure they once sold to the world and to themselves. The war that Vladimir Putin once sold to the Russian people as a swift and calculated operation has now become a grinding, unpredictable, and deeply embarrassing stalemate, one that is beginning to reshape the political atmosphere inside Russia in ways the Kremlin never anticipated. What was supposed to be a lightning-fast show of strength has exposed the fragility of Russia's military planning and the limits of its combat power. And every day that passes without progress places more weight on the system that Putin has spent decades constructing. This is a moment where silence from the battlefield speaks louder than any propaganda broadcast on state television. The momentum Russia once claimed to possess has evaporated, leaving behind a war that drags on with no clear direction and no sign of a decisive victory. And inside the Kremlin, they know it, they feel it, they fear it. Because a stalled war does more than drain resources, it drains legitimacy. From the very beginning, Putin depended on the illusion of control, the idea that every step was calculated and every outcome predetermined. That illusion is cracking. Russian commanders, already stretched thin, now find themselves fighting not only the Ukrainian resistance, but the growing realization that their own operational capabilities are slipping. Troop shortages, equipment failures, disrupted supply lines, all symptoms of deeper systemic flaws that were hidden for years under a veneer of bravado and well-crafted deception. And the longer these problems persist, the harder they become to hide. Soldiers on the front lines speak in hushed tones about shortages, about exhaustion, about strategies that feel improvised rather than planned. Even military bloggers, once fiercely loyal, have started criticizing the leadership subtly at first, and now with increasing boldness. This is not the voice of confidence. This is the voice of a system losing its grip. What makes this stalemate even more damaging is that every stalled advance sends a political shockwave back to Moscow. The Kremlin thrives on results. It thrives on the perception that Russia is always moving forward, always expanding, always dictating the terms. But now the war is dictating the terms, and it is dictating them to Putin. Each week without progress chips away at the narrative of Russian inevitability, replacing it with a growing sense of vulnerability. And vulnerability is dangerous in a country where power is maintained not through trust, but through the projection of strength. When that projection fades even slightly, people in the system begin to reassess their loyalty. They begin to calculate risks. They begin to wonder what happens when the war stops being an external conflict and becomes an internal political liability. But perhaps the most telling sign of this stalled momentum is the way the Kremlin is trying to control the narrative. Louder, the state media insists that everything is going according to plan, the clearer it becomes that the plan has gone off the rails. The desperation shows in the forced enthusiasm of broadcasters and the silence surrounding battlefield losses. In the increasingly vague reports of tactical repositioning. These are not the words of a confident government. They are the linguistic fingerprints of a leadership scrambling to maintain a storyline that reality no longer supports. And every attempt to tighten that narrative only highlights the fact that the truth is slipping beyond their reach. There is a rising tension inside Russia, subtle, quiet, but unmistakable. A feeling that the war stagnation is not just a military issue, but a symptom of something deeper, something structural. The once unstoppable machine of the Russian state is now grinding against the limits of its own contradictions. A, and the Kremlin knows that a war without victories is a war that exposes every weakness they try so hard to hide. That is why the current moment is so critical. A, because a stuck war doesn't just stall on the battlefield, it stalls the political heartbeat of the nation. A, it forces people to look at the leadership not as saviors or strategists, but as men who have run out of options. And when a system built on strength begins to look weak, that is when the true revolution begins, not with protests in the streets, but with doubts inside the palace, doubts that grow louder with every day the war refuses to move forward. Inside the Kremlin, a quiet but unmistakable tremor is moving through the ranks, one that Putin has spent his entire political life trying to prevent for years. The inner circle operated like a sealed chamber, loyal, synchronized, and aligned in the belief that Putin's decisions were unquestionable. But the war has changed that equilibrium. And now those once silent corridors are filled with conversations that would have been unthinkable just a year ago. High-ranking officials who previously walked in lockstep with Putin are beginning to break the rhythm. They speak more cautiously, choosing their words with kind of precision that comes only when loyalty is no longer a guarantee, but a calculation. And that shift, subtle, nearly invisible from the outside, is emerging as one of the most dangerous developments for the Kremlin. Because when a system depends entirely on unity at the top, even a crack can feel like an earthquake. Behind closed doors, disagreements that were once quickly dismissed or smoothed over have begun to linger. Some are tactical disputes, arguments over troop deployments, questions about logistics, skepticism about intelligence reports that no longer match the reality on the ground. Others are far more structural. Military chiefs blame intelligence officials. Intelligence officials blame the political strategists. Oligarchs blame everyone. And at the center of this growing storm sits Putin, increasingly isolated, increasingly surrounded by men who are no longer speaking with one voice. They're speaking with divergent instincts, conflicting interests, and rising doubts. And doubts inside an authoritarian system are not just dangerous, they are contagious. As the war's failures become harder to camouflage, these internal fractures deepen. Once Putin's authority was so absolute that even the hint of dissent could end a career overnight. Today, some officials are taking calculated risks, pushing back more openly during briefings, challenging assessments, asking the kind of pointed questions that signal dissatisfaction rather than obedience. It's still subtle. No open confrontation, no dramatic resignations, but the tone has shifted. The shield of fear is thinning. And in a political environment built on fear, that shift is seismic. Because when people who have been silent for decades begin to test the boundaries, it means they sense something: instability, opportunity, or perhaps both. The Kremlin's internal machinery is also grinding under the pressure of competing narratives. Military elites want stronger action. Political advisors urge restraint. Security agencies push for harsher crackdowns. Each faction is trying to protect its position, its influence, its future. And when those futures feel uncertain, a survival instincts kick in. That's when alliances reshape themselves. That's when old loyalties fade. That's when men who once swore absolute allegiance begin to whisper about alternatives, different strategies, different leadership, different outcomes. These aren't rebellions, not yet. They are recalibrations. But every recalibration shifts the balance of power a little more. Even Putin's most trusted lieutenants are behaving differently. Some appear more visibly nervous in public briefings, their language suddenly careful, almost rehearsed. Others have gone conspicuously quiet, avoiding statements that could tie them to decisions now considered failures. And still others are showing an unusual eagerness to promote their own successes, stepping into the spotlight with the kind of assertiveness that suggests they're preparing for something beyond the current hierarchy. These are the small tales of a political system under strain, tales that reveal far more than the Kremlin is willing to admit. The growing tension inside the Kremlin is not explosive, not theatrical. It is slow, creeping, and deliberate. Exactly the kind of tension that authoritarian regimes fear most. A, it builds behind the mask of unity. It gathers in whispered conversations, in sidelong glances during briefings, in late night calls between officials weighing their options. A, and it grows every time the war produces another setback. Every time the fast aid of control slips. A, every time Putin appears less like an untouchable figure and more like a leader whose decisions are being quietly questioned by the very people who once upheld them without hesitation. A power structure built on absolute authority cannot easily survive a moment when that authority begins to fracture. And tonight, those fractures are no longer just rumors. They are part of the political landscape, shaping the future in ways that even Putin may no longer be able to control. Across Russia, a quiet but powerful shift is taking place, one that the Kremlin has tried desperately to contain but can no longer fully suppress. For months, the government has relied on its vast censorship machine to shape the public narrative, to steer conversations, to silence doubt before it can take root. Yet the reality of the war has seeped through the cracks, finding its way into kitchens, workplaces, commuter trains, and encrypted chat groups. Russians may not have full access to the truth, but they feel the consequences of this conflict in ways that no propaganda broadcast can erase. And that feeling, subtle, unsettling, impossible to ignore, is slowly transforming into a collective unease. The Kremlin can suppress information, but it cannot suppress the human instinct to question what no longer makes sense. The economic pressures alone are enough to stir frustration. Prices rise quietly at first. Then sudden familiar products disappear from store shelves. Jobs become insecure. The ruble weakens. Families with loved ones mobilized or deployed at the front are living with a constant tension that no patriotic slogan can soften. These are not abstract issues. They are daily realities. And every new hardship chips away at the confidence people once had in their government's ability to control events. It's not that Russians are staging mass protests. It's that millions are living with a growing sense that something is fundamentally wrong. They may not say it loudly, but they are thinking it, they are feeling it. And in societies built on controlled narratives, private realizations are often more dangerous than public demonstrations. Then there are the casualties. Official numbers are carefully curated, sanitized, rewritten. But Russia is a country of connections, villages, communities, a relative scattered across regions that talk to each other whether the state likes it or not. When soldiers don't come home, when funerals become more frequent, when young men vanish from classrooms, factories, and neighborhoods, the truth becomes impossible to hide. Mothers, wives, brothers, they know the war isn't going as planned. And they know the promises of quick victory were illusions. And their grief carries a quiet power, a kind of moral weight that even the most rigid state machinery cannot silence indefinitely. When loss becomes widespread, it becomes political. Despite the risks, small acts of resistance, tiny, almost invisible gestures have begun to take shape across the country. People mutter jokes under their breath about the leadership. Sharpened news clips privately turn down the volume when state anchors repeat the same hollow talking points. These small behaviors might seem insignificant, but they represent a shift in mindset. Russians who once passively accepted the official narrative are now actively questioning it. And in authoritarian systems, a questioning is the first step toward dissent. Fear still controls the public stage, but in private spaces, a fear has begun to share the room with curiosity, and curiosity has a way of spreading. The younger generation especially feels disconnected from the war entirely. They see their future shrinking, fewer opportunities, fewer freedoms, fewer prospects of stability. Many have left the country. Many more wish they could. And those who remain understand that their lives are being shaped by decisions they never supported, made by leaders who seem increasingly distant from the people they claim to represent. This generational tension creates a divide the Kremlin cannot easily mend. The older generation may tolerate hardship, but the younger generation questions it. And questioning is the kind of spark that once ignited becomes very hard to extinguish. Even state media, the crown jewel of the Kremlin's control apparatus, has begun to betray signs of strain. Anchors speak with forced enthusiasm. Commentators pivot awkwardly when facts don't align, and political talk shows, once triumphantly aggressive, now carry an undertone of uncertainty. It's as if everyone understands that the script is no longer believable, but feels compelled to recite it anyway. And the more they push the narrative, the clearer it becomes to viewers that the truth lies somewhere far beyond the television set. The Kremlin fears public discontent not because it expects a sudden revolution, but because it understands the danger of slow cumulative doubt. It knows that when people stop believing, they stop trusting. And when they stop trusting, they stop obeying. What is unfolding inside Russia right now is not an uprising. It is a psychological shift, a swelling realization that the war is bleeding the country in ways no one signed up for. And that shift, quiet as it may, poses a greater long-term threat to the regime than any external pressure ever could. For more than 2 decades, Vladimir Putin built his political identity on a single powerful illusion, the image of an unshakable, calculating, and almost mythically strong leader who always knew more, acted faster, and controlled outcomes long before the world even realized what he was planning. That mythology was the foundation of his authority, not just in the eyes of the Russian public, but among the elites whose loyalty has always depended on the belief that Putin could guarantee their safety, their wealth, and their future. But now, in the harsh light of a stalled war and mounting internal pressures, that carefully engineered image is beginning to crack. And when a leader's strength is mostly built on perception, the moment that perception falters, everything else begins to unravel with it. Even the smallest hint of vulnerability becomes a spark in a room full of political oxygen. You can see the shift not in dramatic public statements, those will never come, but in the subtle telling ways Putin's behavior has changed. The once confident posture has tightened. The speeches once full of certainty now sound defensive, repetitive, strangely hollow. And the public appearances designed to project dominance now feel like stage performances trying too hard to reassure an audience that no longer believes the lines. Putin's attempts to reassert strength, standing with generals, issuing stern warnings, making symbolic visits come across less as demonstrations of control and more as evidence that control must be demonstrated at all. That in itself is revealing. Strong leaders do not need to prove their strength. Leaders who fear they are losing it do. Inside the Kremlin, this shift has become impossible to ignore. Officials who long relied on Putin's decisiveness now whisper that he seems hesitant, reactive, sometimes even confused about battlefield realities. He is reported to demand loyalty, not through inspiration, but through pressure, through ritualized displays of obedience that no longer carry the same conviction. And when subordinates sense hesitation at the top, they begin adjusting their own strategies, not based on loyalty, but on survival. That marks the beginning of a dangerous political cycle. A leader who fears loss of power, surrounded by elites who fear the leader's weakening grip. In Russia's political system, that dynamic has rarely ended well. Externally, Putin's vulnerability is magnified even further. For years, he projected Russia as a rising power, a nation capable of shifting the global balance. But the war has revealed limitations the Kremlin never wanted the world to see. The military, touted as modernized and formidable, is struggling to advance. The intelligence services, once feared for their precision, have miscalculated critical strategic realities. And diplomatic isolation has reduced Russia's influence in ways even longtime allies can no longer disguise. Every setback chips away at the aura of strategic genius Putin cultivated. Every miscalculation forces observers, both domestic and international, to reconsider the narrative they once believed. And in geopolitics, once a leader loses the mystique of competence, it's almost impossible to reclaim it. The public senses it too. Russians may not have full access to information. But they know when their leaders look less confident, when speeches feel less convincing, when promises ring emptier than before. They notice the tightening of censorship, the more aggressive propaganda, the sudden urgency in messaging that used to be calm and controlled. Those changes signal something insecurity. The Kremlin's efforts to project strength now reveal the opposite. When you must constantly insist you are in control, it's usually because you're not. And what makes this moment so consequential is that Putin's entire system of power was built on the assumption that he could not be challenged, not by rivals, not by the public, but not by events outside his control. But the war has shattered that assumption. Suddenly, the man who once appeared untouchable is facing pressures from all sides. A stalled military campaign, emboldened critics and frustrated elites, and a population beginning to see the limits of the leadership they were told was invincible. This erosion of image isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, it doesn't need to be. It works slowly, quietly, steadily undermining the psychological foundation of political power. And that is the real danger for the Kremlin. Once a leader who has ruled through fear, manufactured strength, begins to look human, fallible, uncertain, weakened, the system that protects him becomes unstable. People stop looking at him as a force of nature and start seeing him as a man cornered by consequences. And when that transformation happens, whether whispered in elite circles or felt quietly among millions, the shift becomes irreversible. Across the global stage, Russia is finding itself in a position it has not experienced in decades. Isolated, pressured, and increasingly cut off from the very alliances and diplomatic channels it once relied on to project influence for years. Putin built his foreign policy on the belief that Russia could outmaneuver the West, divide its rivals, and cultivate powerful partners who would stand by Moscow no matter how aggressive its actions became. But the war has upended those assumptions. Countries that once tolerated, excused, or quieted Russia's geopolitical ambitions are now stepping back, are reevaluating their commitments in ways that would have seemed impossible before the conflict began. And that distancing is more than a diplomatic inconvenience for the Kremlin. It is a direct threat to the stability of the system Putin has spent decades constructing. Because when a nation depends on the illusion of global legitimacy, the erosion of that legitimacy strikes at the heart of its power. Sanctions have been a major driver of this shift. What started as targeted economic measures has evolved into one of the most comprehensive financial isolations ever imposed on a major world economy. Banks cut ties, corporations pulled out, investors fled, entire sectors collapsed under pressure. But the most damaging effect isn't the immediate economic hit. It's the message these actions send about Russia's long-term viability as a global partner. Countries that once viewed Moscow as a dependable, if complicated, ally now question whether maintaining that relationship is worth the economic and political cost. And when those questions begin emerging in capitals that previously sympathized with Russian interests, the Kremlin knows the tide is shifting. Even China, the partner Putin has tried to elevate his Russia strategic counterbalance to the West, has grown noticeably cautious publicly. Beijing maintains a posture of neutrality and cooperation, but quietly it has reduced certain financial exposures, slowed down joint projects, and avoided taking any stance that could jeopardize its own global interests. China understands that aligning too closely with a struggling Russia risks international backlash and risks entangling itself in a war that offers little reward. This subtle distancing carries enormous symbolism, and if the one country positioned as Russia's strongest lifeline begins to hedge its bets, others will certainly follow. And that creates an environment in which Moscow cannot comfortably predict where its future alliances will stand. Former Soviet partners once expected to remain within Russia's sphere of influence have also begun reassessing their loyalties. Nations like Kazakhstan, Armenia, and even Belarus, countries traditionally bound to Moscow through history, economics, or security, are now navigating their relationships with a new and cautious tone. Some are strengthening ties with the West. Others are distancing themselves diplomatically, avoiding overt support for Russia's actions. This shift suggests a deeper understanding within the region. Russia is no longer the stable, commanding presence it once appeared to be. It is a nation consumed by internal conflict and external isolation, and that vulnerability weakens its ability to act as a regional anchor. On the global economic front, the long-term consequences are even more profound. Energy markets, once dominated by Russian leverage, are rapidly diversifying. Hey, European nations that depended on Russian oil and gas for generations have pivoted with surprising speed toward new suppliers and renewable sources. What was once Russia's most valuable geopolitical weapon is now losing its potency. Without energy dominance, Russia's influence weakens further, leaving the Kremlin with fewer bargaining chips and fewer avenues to pressure the international community. This economic recalibration is not temporary, it is structural. And Putin knows that once those markets adjust, they rarely return to their old patterns. International organizations, too, have tightened their stance. Forums where Russia once held significant sway have become arenas of condemnation or cautious avoidance. Global leaders who once met with Putin, as a matter of course, now hesitate, calculating the political cost of being photographed, shaking hands with a man associated with a prolonged, brutal conflict. Diplomacy thrives on perception, and the perception of Russia today is one of decline, aggression, and instability. That shift carries consequences that extend far beyond symbolic gestures. It affects treaties, a trade cooperation, intelligence, sharing, and long-term geopolitical planning. What makes this moment especially dangerous for Putin is that international isolation feeds directly into domestic instability. A leader who once promised Russians a place at the world's table is now presiding over a nation increasingly cut off from it. Every diplomatic cold shoulder becomes a reminder that the war has not elevated Russia. It has diminished it. And when the world begins to treat a once powerful nation as a liability rather than a partner, the effects ripple inward, shaking confidence, draining influence, and exposing the limits of a regime built on the myth of global strength. What is unfolding inside Russia right now is not a dramatic explosion of dissent, not a sudden uprising in the streets, but something far more subtle, far more consequential, and far more dangerous for the Kremlin. A slow, burning political crisis that is beginning to reshape the foundations of the Russian state from within. It is a crisis without a clear beginning and without a single defining moment, yet its presence is undeniable. You can feel it in the tone of state media, in the guarded language of officials, in the anxious whispers circulating among elites who once behaved as if Putin's authority would never falter. This kind of internal tension does not announce itself loudly. It builds quietly, accumulating weight with every failure on the battlefield, every economic strain, every political miscalculation. And now that pressure is approaching a threshold that even Putin's carefully engineered system may struggle to contain. The heart of this crisis lies in the convergence of multiple fractures: military stagnation, elite mistrust, public discontent, and international isolation, all colliding at a moment when the Kremlin least expected it. Individually, each of these problems could be managed, contained, redirected. But together, they form a web of instability that is tightening around the very center of power. In authoritarian systems, the illusion of control is often more important than control itself. When that illusion fades, the structure begins to wobble. And what Russia is experiencing now is the unmistakable wobble of a system that is no longer operating with the cold, disciplined certainty once projected inside the government. The atmosphere has shifted from confidence to calculation. Officials are no longer thinking about how to advance Putin's agenda. They are thinking about how to protect themselves from the fallout of decisions they no longer fully trust. Some are hedging their loyalty, aligning themselves with emerging factions. Others are quietly distancing themselves from the war's failures, framing their roles in ways that shield them from blame. These subtle realignments are the earliest signs of a political transformation, the kind that in Russia's history has often preceded major shifts in leadership or policy. And the frightening truth for the Kremlin is that once elites begin preparing for change, that change becomes exponentially more likely. But the crisis is not confined to political elites. It is spreading through society, not as mass protests, but as a growing sense of psychological exhaustion. Russians are tired of uncertainty, tired of economic strain, tired of being told that everything is under control when the evidence around them suggests the opposite. This exhaustion is not dramatic, but it is deep. It shows up in the declining enthusiasm for state narratives, in the rising desire to leave the country, in the quiet refusal to participate in patriotic events meant to prop up the illusion of national unity. When citizens disengage emotionally, when they stop believing in the purpose or direction of their government, the regime loses one of its most essential tools, the ability to mobilize society through fear or pride. Economically, the country is also approaching a breaking point. Sanctions have not collapsed Russia's economy outright, but they have created a grinding pressure that eroded stability from the inside. Businesses struggle, investment dries up, and long-term growth prospects darken. For ordinary Russians, this means higher prices, fewer opportunities, and a pervasive sense that their future is shrinking. When people feel trapped inside a system that offers no clear path forward, they begin to look for someone to blame. And in a political environment dominated by a single leader, blame has only one destination. The most dangerous aspect of this slow burn crisis, however, is its unpredictability. Unlike sudden revolutions or rapid political collapses, this kind of internal decay does not follow a clear timeline. It builds quietly, then accelerates without warning. It creates moments of unexpected rupture, moments when a bureaucratic disagreement becomes a political confrontation, when a modest protest becomes a national symbol, when a single elite defection becomes the turning point no one saw coming. Systems based on manufactured stability are often the ones most vulnerable to sudden shifts because they have no mechanisms to absorb shock. They rely on absolute control until the moment that control is no longer absolute. And that is where Russia now stands, on the edge of a transformation it cannot fully predict or contain. The tension may remain quiet for a while, simmering in the background as the war drags on. But the forces driving it are only growing stronger. A nation cannot sustain this level of political, economic, and military strain without consequences. And when those consequences arrive, they rarely unfold gently. They come in waves, first subtle, then unstoppable, reshaping the landscape in ways that even the most powerful leaders cannot reverse. This story continues to unfold. One thing is becoming increasingly clear. Attention inside Russia is no longer a background whisper. It's a rising alarm. Putin may still project confidence. He may still tighten his grip on power. But the forces around him, military failure, political doubt, public frustration, are moving in one direction. And that direction is away from the stability he once promised. What happens next may not be sudden, but it will be significant. History has a way of catching up with those who believe they can outrun it forever.